What do you notice about the twins' speech? Is there any linguistic structure there? Is there any semantic content? And what does it consist of? Oh, the intonation. Yes, the intonation is going up and down. Does it sound sort of like English intonation, kind of? A bit like English intonation, and actually young kids by age 1 do have a sense for the intonation of their parents' language, or the L1 that they're exposed to. So you hear intonation, and it seems to make, maybe they're using intonation to convey emotion, the way adults do, the way it goes up and down, da-da-da, da-da-da, you know, like, get away, or something, I don't know. Do you think they're really trying to say anything meaningful? My sense is that they're discovering this thing called language, and they're playing with it, and they're having fun, and maybe imitating adults. It's hard to get inside the head of a little child like that, so it's hard to know. I feel like they're just playing with language and having fun with it. And their syllables mainly are sort of a da-da-da, and it's kind of a D, or sometimes a glottalized D, I think, sometimes slightly glottalized. I don't know if you can. And then a vowel is kind of like an ah, kind of a very front ah, or maybe an ah, but it's kind of an ah that's maybe raised or lowered a bit, somewhere between ah and ah. And it's kind of like often da-da, kind of two pairs together, da-da, two syllables. And that's like a lot of common English words, high frequency English words tend to be two syllables. Like your most basic Anglo-French, Anglo-Saxon words are two syllables. And that's because two syllables is easy. One syllable, two syllables, maybe three, da-da-da, something like that. Simple 1, 2, 3 syllable strings, and these kids are about maybe, I think about a year and a half, I think. That's one example of what we might call baby talk, when babies talk to each other and when they're learning to talk. Now there's another kind of baby talk, and that describes the way that parents, caregivers, mothers, and fathers talk to children. So that's another thing that we call baby talk. And we're going to talk about it later today. And the book seems a little dismissive of baby talk, but actually there is some disagreement, and some people think that actually is valuable or important, even if not all cultures use it. But I've heard of some people think, I've heard of some people say, I won't do that to my children. I want them to learn, proper language and such. So what we call baby talk, or infant-directed speech, or motherese, something like infant-directed speech is kind of the term now. Do you think that it's actually useful or helpful for children, especially for language learning? So that's today's daily poll question. Do you agree or disagree that baby talk to children, adults engaging in baby talk or infant-directed speech or motherese to children, is helpful for them? You agree or disagree? So that's today's daily poll question. Indicate whether you agree or disagree with the claim that baby talk or infant-directed speech can be helpful for children. Because it's actually a question that's not resolved yet. The book seems skeptical, but it's actually an unresolved question. More research is needed. So while you're doing that, let me just give an overview of some of the things I'll talk about today. Try to talk about it as long as my voice lasts. We'll talk again a little bit about the critical period, poverty of the stimulus, universal grammar a little bit, phonological, syntactic, morphological, pragmatic acquisition and competence in children. Talk a little bit about infant-directed speech, motherese, caregiver talk, baby talk, whatever you like. Talk a little bit today about bilingualism, and probably next time a little bit more about bilingualism is next time we talk about L2 learning or acquisition. Pretty much majority of you are in the middle or kind of agree. We'll come back to that later. 44 answers, okay. Then of course, as a proud father, I'm going to share some of my son's linguistic productions as an unabashedly proud father. All right, little historical background. So we talked about this like the second week or so. In the 1950s, B.F. Skinner, who we today regard as kind of a master of experimental technique, but in terms of theory, a crackpot, misguided, smart, but a misguided genius. He tried to apply his theory of stimulus and response to explaining how children learn the first language, and tried to explain it in terms of stimulus and response and repetition. Along comes Noam Chomsky, at the time a PhD student, 1957, publishes a scathing critical review of Skinner's book in a linguistics journal, and just ripped Skinner to shreds. And he showed that this can't explain how children learn their first language. There's not enough input to explain the things that children say. They sometimes get very minimal input about certain aspects of the grammar, like maybe quantifiers. I'll show you a cartoon example later about quantifiers. What does a quantifier refer to? Sometimes it refers to the noun right after it, like much or many, but sometimes it can refer to the verb or to something else in the sentence. How do they know? And actually, they figure things out like that. They figure out, based on relatively little evidence, where to put various function words as they're learning, or at least they can understand it when adults talk to them. There are all kinds of things like that, verb forms and such, the way they learn verb forms, and we'll talk about irregular verbs in a minute, that they get in a way that shows they're actually learning rules. But no one ever teaches them rules explicitly. And can you teach children explicitly grammar rules? Okay, now in this language, we put our verbs at the end of the sentence. You know, have you ever seen adults try to correct children's grammar? Do they get it? No. Children make mistakes, adults correct them. The children don't understand why they're being corrected. They just totally don't get it, because they can't think abstractly about something like grammar that requires meta-linguistic thought, thinking about language, which is what you do when you learn a second language when you're older. We teach you this is the present tense, this is the past tense, and so on. Children can't do that, but they're doing grammar in their head subconsciously. They do it subconsciously. They're learning the rules. And how is it that they can do that? Well, Chomsky argued there's so much complexity in the syntax of phonology, the morphology of grammar, that there must be some kind of, I don't know, language acquisition device or some sort of toolbox, mental toolbox that they're born with. And he actually spoke of the universal grammar, which is some set of abstract principles that they're born with, maybe abstract knowledge, subconscious knowledge that they're born with about what's possible in a human language. And each language kind of picks from this toolbox what it wants. German picks this and French picks that. And then they have in their heads, maybe, we don't really use the term anymore, but Chomsky called it a language acquisition device, some methods, some techniques for kind of then working out, this is what's possible in the human language, this is what I'm hearing and what my parents are saying, and kind of adjust the settings and maybe form kind of unconscious hypotheses. Maybe they put verbs here in the language. Okay, they do. Subconscious hypotheses testing, maybe. We think more in terms of maybe cognitive strategies today rather than some kind of mechanical sounding abstract language acquisition device. But it would seem to argue for some kind of universal grammar, some universal set of principles. We're not consciously aware of them, but they're in our brains that we're born with, that a child can use in order to figure out the grammar of the language, the L1 that he or she hears. And when we say L1, a child can have two L1s. The terminology is a little clunky. It was developed by, well, Americans, and America, US and Britain are monolingual cultures when much of the world is bilingual. So when we say L1, we just mean a native language. A child can have two L1s, as we'll talk about later when we talk about bilingualism. My son is a great bilingual. That way, puts me to shame. Let's see some examples. So poverty of the stimulus. Productivity. Children can produce new sentences that they've never heard before. And it seems to be that they're applying the rules that they figured out. And again, they figure these rules out subconsciously. You can't talk consciously to children about grammar rules. It won't make sense to them. It's abstract knowledge. They can't really think about consciously, but subconsciously they're figuring out and applying the rules, and they see new sentences, lots of creative new sentences, and if you've been around children, they can be creative about their sentences. When it comes to universal grammar, so universal grammar is relevant for two things. One is explaining child language learning, L1 acquisition, and two, just explaining the syntax and morphology and phonology of languages around the world. Not everyone believes in universal grammar. It's still a bit controversial. One example of controversy, by the way, was in the news recently, the science news anyway. We talked earlier about recursion. When you did syntax, we talked about recursion. For example, with nouns, you can stack noun phrases and prepositions modified with nouns, modified prepositions on and on, seemingly ad infinitum. The flea on the tail of the mouse, on the cat on the table. You can go on and on with prepositional phrases, modifying nouns like that. Relative clauses, the cat that sat on the mat, that ate the rat, that chased the rat, that chased the mouse, that ate the cricket or something like that. You go on and on with relative clause embedding. Silly examples. But anyway, an anthropological linguist a couple of years ago, claimed to have found an Amazonian language. Well, it's been known for a while, this language, Piraha, and it claimed that this language has no recursion. Whether that claim is actually true or not, I guess probably remains to be verified. But people argue about this. Some people say, well, this language doesn't have recursion, that disproves universal grammar. But then a lot of people who believe in universal grammar will say, why? Just because one language doesn't choose recursion, why does that disprove universal grammar? What is it in the theory that says all languages have to choose to have recursion? Why is that? And this is something that people argue about. It may depend on how one formulates a theory of universal grammar. And is this language learning, by the way, due to universal grammar in children, or are they just applying general cognitive, psychological methods, devices to figuring out the language? So it's a good question. So even if there is a critical period, which most people think there is, maybe it doesn't necessarily prove universal grammar. My thoughts on this, again, this is a bit of a controversy. I'll go ahead and get a little theoretical right here. I tend to believe in universal grammar, but I think that the theory has not been formulated precisely enough. I think there are problems with the way the theory has been formulated. So I tend to believe it, but I think it needs more scientific precision. So when we talk about theories in the academic world, you can have theories like in humanities, like literary theories, where a community of scholars accept a theory because it works. It works for us, it explains things well. In science, a theory is a little different, because in science, a theory is supposed to make specific predictions about what you would find. If you look at specific things, what you would find. Those predictions are called hypotheses. And a hypothesis is something you can test in an experiment. So we talked about, I think the second week, what a theory is in academic fields. A theory is an explanatory framework. So it's not a conjecture or a guess. That would be a hypothesis. It's an explanatory framework. In all fields, when you say theory, it's an explanatory framework. And as an explanatory framework, it consists of maybe several propositions or claims. And you can kind of spell them out and list them. 1, 2, 3, 4. In science, you can prove a theory. Now, in, say, humanities fields, when you have a theory, you're not trying to prove it. It's just you accept it, it works. This is a nice theory for cross-cultural issues in literary analysis. We accept it, it works for us. Those of us who analyze cross-cultural issues in novels and short stories with multicultural settings. So theories in all fields are explanatory frameworks, and you can kind of list the propositions or principles that make up theory. And it should be very tight, consistent, logical set of principles that are logically motivated, or in science, empirically motivated. Like each one of these claims is based on good reasons, good evidence. And they fit together very tightly, coherently, especially in scientific theories. So it can prove a theory in science. Darwin's theory of evolution has been proven because you can kind of list out maybe four or five major claims that comprise the theory of evolution. And it leads to many, many specific predictions that have been tested. thousands and thousands of studies have proven the theory of evolution. In fact, in Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, Darwin explained, if you wanted to falsify evolution, these are the things you would look for. He actually explained, if you want to prove evolution wrong, look for this or this or this. Those things were not found. Instead, we found lots of evidence that proves the theory of evolution. Einstein's general theory and special theory of relativity have been proven again and again through thousands of experiments. Lots of different predictions or hypotheses that follow from it. The problem with universal grammar as a theory, in my feeling, is this. It's an interesting theory, but it needs to be spelled out more precisely. Like, what are the propositions that make up universal grammar? It's kind of hard to, I tried to spell it out, but I had to search and think, because no one really bothers to spell out what are the specific propositions. But even then, I think they're not really specific or coherent enough to make testable predictions. So it's like Chomsky was trying to create more of a humanities-style theory, but not really a scientific theory. And this is a scientific question. How are human languages related? Do they have the same underlying structures? How do children learn language? These are scientific questions. So we need a theory that's more scientifically precise, that leads to predictions. And a good theory leads to predictions you can test so that it can either confirm or falsify the theory. And a good theory is falsifiable. You can test it and prove it wrong or right. And I feel like this theory of universal grammar needs to be more specific so that it is falsifiable. That is, you can test it. It can make specific predictions and prove it wrong or right through testing. And I feel that's the weakness of this theory. So when it comes to a language like Piraha, the theory is a little bit unclear as to what it would predict. So we need a specific theory. Okay, does the theory predict that, and why would it predict that most languages would choose to have recursion, but a few wouldn't? If so, why? And if a language chooses not to have that feature, is it going to pick something else instead? Okay. What are the exact features, and how are languages going to pick and choose them? And then how is a child going to use that to learn a language? So I think the theory needs more clarity. Until then, it's going to continue to be controversial. Just my thoughts. All right, moving on. So there is a critical period. I don't have it in here. So the critical period is, anyway, it's in the book. It's in the slides later. Supposedly, by about the age of puberty, children have to be exposed to a language in order to learn it naturally, to learn it subconsciously. That's the critical period. And it's not like an abrupt ending, but it's like a window that kind of slowly closes from about maybe the time of puberty or pre-puberty until maybe early in the teenage years. And it varies. It's different for phonology versus syntax and morphology. It can vary according to other factors, including individual differences. It's not so well understood. But there is a critical period around puberty. There are other critical periods in biology. So in biology, critical periods are not controversial at all. It's accepted in biology. There are critical periods for other things like social attachment. A baby in the first 3 years of life has to attach socially to a caregiver, a mother or a father or some person. If the baby doesn't form that emotional attachment, intimate emotional attachment, the child will have problems later in life with intimate relationships. There is a critical period, the first few months of life, for vestibular balance. So the vestibulum is kind of an organ in your ear, or it's part of the cochlea that handles your balance. And so imagine if a baby is, we've never tested this in humans, but from other mammals we know. This is true pretty much of higher mammals. If for some reason a baby is not exposed to, gravity or the chance to stand and walk upright, they're not going to learn balance, natural balance. If for some reason a mammal is just not allowed to see the world in the first few months of life, and then later it can see the world, it's going to have trouble. It's not impossible, but it's going to have trouble learning to interpret the visual input It's called visual cognition. So it's not just your eyes that are seeing the world, but your brain. Your brain is interpreting all of the light patterns that are coming into your eyes. Your brain interprets that. It's visual cognition. So there are critical periods for those things. It's not that they can't be overcome with effort, but it takes effort and practice, and it's not going to be quite the same. In the early days of this theory, it was explained in terms of lateralization, left hemisphere, but we now know this is not the case. It's not because around puberty language functions get assigned to the left hemisphere. That's not the case. So you see that in older literature, lateralization. So is it true that you use only 10% of your brain? If you believe that, then you're only using 10% of your brain because it's complete BS. There's absolutely no truth to that claim. The 10% of your brain myth, it's total nonsense. There's no scientific basis for that whatsoever. Now, what about this left brain, right brain stuff you've heard? That language is on the left is logical, analytical, language and math are on the left, and art and music are on the right hemisphere. Is that true? There is some lateralization, but it's way more complicated than that, and it's not at all like the pop psychology nonsense you've heard. It may be true for children that much of the language is in the left, but it changes as they go through puberty, as they go through the critical period, it changes. So for you adults, if you are right-handed, your grammar functions, phonology, morphology, syntax are on the left. If you're left-handed, that stuff is in the right. Other things, though, like many aspects of semantic interpretation, if your grammar is in the left, then your right side, your right hemisphere, is doing a lot of semantic and metaphorical interpretation, pragmatics. And actually, there are the pragmatics of intonation and things like that. Vocabulary and word meanings, that's all over your brain. Music, for example, music is processed by different aspects of music are processed by both right and left hemispheres. Recognizing objects, art, math, geometry, they're split up between both hemispheres. So the left brain, right brain stuff you've heard is not true. The critical period is not due to functions being assigned to a certain hemisphere or certain parts of the brain. It's more like changes in neuroplasticity. Your brain consists of neurons, or brain cells, and synapses, and we're going to talk about this more in the next week or two. You're born with about, 200 billion neurons at birth. It's extremely easy for your brain at first to make new connections, and actually you're born with lots and lots of connections. But over time, the unused connections kind of get pruned away, especially at puberty. So at puberty, a lot of unused synaptic connections in your brain cells get pruned away, they're not being used. And your ability to form new connections changes. You can still form new connections, but it's not as wild and easy as it was when you're a child. In fact, you're born with a lot of connections in the brain already, or new connections form in the first few months of life as an infant. And it seems to be changes in this neural flexibility or plasticity, we call it, that happen around puberty that seems to explain critical periods like this in the different stages, particularly around puberty. So it seems to be changes in how the brain works in general, and it's true that language functions do get assigned to particular places, but more importantly, it's the changes in this neural flexibility around puberty that seem to be involved in the critical period for language. It's not fully understood why this happens, but it seems to be that you're born with lots and lots of connections and more even form in your first few months of life because you've got a lot to learn about the world, so it's like a quick learning device. Then around puberty, the brain's like, okay, we don't need all this hardware. Let's get rid of the stuff we're not using, be more efficient, become an adult. Something like that. To what degree is language its own unique thing, a language acquisition device or universal grammar? To what degree is language and language acquisition dependent on other cognitive or psychological mechanisms? It's not clear yet. How did language evolve in humans? It's not exactly clear. We don't really know. But it's probably for the purpose of social communication, social functions. And in terms of human history, the increase in brain size in human evolution tends to correspond with the degree to which humans were forming social groups. So there's probably a correlation between language evolution and the human species becoming more social and forming groups. Well, you can take a whole class on that. But the exact root of language evolution is unclear. So when born, babies kind of are in the silent period. They spend like the first year, you think they're doing nothing, but they're listening to us. They're listening, adults are talking to them. They can't respond, but they're listening and they're absorbing, and their brains are probably working and figuring out the grammar and the language. So when you're talking to them, they're not just passive recipients. There's probably something going on in there. So what's the role of infant-directed speech? The book seems kind of skeptical, but I'm not. So in the daily poll, majority of you were kind of like 3 or 4, kind of neutral or somewhat agree that it's useful. One time I read, I think it was a paper by an anthropologist who claimed, well, she observed a tribe, and I think in Samoa, Western Samoa, and she just made a blanket claim that adults don't engage in infant-directed speech with their children. But she didn't provide much evidence. If they don't do baby talk, how are they talking to the children? How are the children learning language? Or if not the adults, what about older children? Do older children take care of younger children and baby talk with them? She didn't really say that. So I tend to be skeptical of these claims. Nonetheless, there are a lot of anthropologists who have reported in some tribal groups that this doesn't occur. Does it mean that it's useless? No, I mean, children still learn to talk. Anyway, it's just that maybe they're a little more delayed in those cultures where grown-ups just don't talk to children much. But there's a lot of research in psychology that shows it is valuable. There's plenty of psychological research that shows that it's valuable for children becoming attuned to the phonology and the intonation and vocabulary of their language. So there's lots of psychological research showing its benefits for child language learning. It doesn't mean that it's absolutely necessary, but it can be useful. And I think it's also, and I didn't really read this, but I'm sure there must be research showing how it's also helpful for the bonding, the emotional bonding, which is relevant too, because language is a social thing. It's for social communication and relationships. It's not just an information transmission device. By the way, what does baby talk consist of? Well, it's got an exaggerated intonation, as you know. Vowel length, the vowel length is exaggerated. People tend to use very hyper-correct pronunciation so that the kids are getting really the clearest phonemes without much allophonic variation, pretty much pure phonemes as much as possible, not much blending or phonological assimilation or stuff like that. The volume is exaggerated. And also reduplication. So reduplication is, well, in baby talk, to use this here. So itsy, bitsy. And also notice that baby talk tends to use a lot of high front vowels. So bit is like something small. So in English, itsy bitsy, or maybe if you're bitty, itty bitty. So we sing the different versions of this, itty bitty. Or from tiny, it gets kind of baby talked into teeny. So teeny. And there are different versions of the spider song. The itsy bitsy spider, the itsy bitsy spider. So I always love singing that to my son and playing the spider with him, tickling him, or the itty bitty spider, or the teeny weeny spider, or something like that. So here we're taking the rhyme, we're stripping off the first onset, and then we're copying it either before or after. So we're copying this, or teeny. The eeny gets reduplicated here, teeny weeny. So you're copying, maybe stripping off the first consonant and copying it. So that's reduplication. And it's a common feature of baby talk. And there's plenty of psychological research showing this is helpful for kids. And parents like it because it's also emotional bonding with the children. So let's talk about phonology. Phonology in lexicon, vocabulary learning. The book points out, within the first year, babies are sensitive to all phonemes, including phonemes that are not in their L1, phonemes they haven't heard. And when they start babbling, they seem to play with phonemes that are not in their language. So this can be tested if you repeat a sound, and including phonemes that they haven't heard before that are not in their language. Like Japanese babies, you go la la la, then go ra ra ra, and then they kind of turn their head or so attention, like, oh, they notice something different. So they can hear the differences. But after 1 year, they start to lose this. If it's not a phoneme in their L1, they will kind of start to lose this ability to notice new phonemes and or hear distinctions between phonemes, like la, ra for Japanese kids, or ha, ha for English-speaking kids and such. Babies exhibit a preference for infant-directed speech. They like it when adults talk to them like that. It gets their attention, so psychology studies show that it gets their attention. They pay attention to that more. And they've developed a preference for the intonation, the stress, the rhythm, intonation of their first language, the prosody of their first language that they're exposed to. They prefer that. And if they hear someone speaking a different language that has a different intonation or prosody, they'll not be interested in it, or they'll think it's strange. So they have a preference for the intonation of their first language by 1 year, or some studies show even by birth. In developmental psychology, they kind of use this notation for, so if you see this in developmental psychology papers, that's 0 years, 2 months, because unfortunately our calendar is not on a decimal system, so we have to use this awkward notation. So at 2 months, the babies start to engage in prevocalic babbling. It's kind of wah, wah, kind of in the back of the throat. It's not really clear vowels, but they're sort of at a pre-babbling stage. And then after that, they move on to babbling with actual consonants, and later real babbling. Mistake there, babbling, typo. So by the age of 1, they are engaging in babbling with syllables, like the twins going da 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 and such. My son used to do that too. Da 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 da. 1.5 years, they start with simple consonant vowel syllables, so consonant vowel syllables like the da you heard in the twins video. Oh, there's my son at age 2. His name is Eugene. Eugene is a boy's name in English. This is my son's vocabulary, age 2 to 3. Talk to each other and explain the structure of his words and how he got his words. This is similar to textbook examples. How did he get those words? And why is he saying them like that? If you can explain number 5, I'll give you extra credit, because I can't explain number 5. All right, Nana. Why is he saying Nana? Okay, so it's shortened from banana, but the book mentions semantic overextension, so they'll learn the word doggy, and they'll say any animal is doggy. They point to a cat and say doggy because they don't know. Well, they don't know the word for cat, so they say doggy until the parents tell them. Well, he's doing some clever semantic extensions here, applying. So again, he's at kind of the 2-syllable stage. At least when he started making up these words, he's at a 2-syllable stage. So he could say banana, but he prefers to say nana. And he shortened it to 2 syllables, and he extended it also to the color yellow. That was his favorite food at this age. Appy, apple, red. Okay, it's easy, but why is he not saying the L in apple? Well, at this stage, they do simple consonant vowel syllables, very simple syllables. And when children first learn to talk, okay, they first get motor control of like the lips of the first words, or like, well, in Korean, like amma, or in other languages, mommy, mama, and then appa, the labial sounds, the M and the P. So most languages of the world, babies' terms for their mother is usually a nasal labial sound, like ma, mama, mommy, mom, amma. And then their words for father are something with a labial stop, papa, appa, papa, or maybe daddy. That's true in most languages of the world. Then they learn how to use the common alveolar sounds, N, L, T, D, S. Those common alveolar sounds, those are the next easiest to learn. And so they simplify syllables to simple consonant vowel sequences with those sounds, preferably. And they can't do consonant clusters, 2 consonants together. They don't do that yet. So they will cut out consonants in order to make for simple consonant vowel sequences. So apple gets reduced to appy. podo, so Korean, podo for grape and for the color purple. I think for some colors he just used the Korean like chosek and such for green. Achi, now this is a different one. Achi, either for light, like the room light, or for the color white. Where do you think that came from? And it's kind of more of a Korean Africa, the chi, more of the Korean achi, not the English cha, because he's been exposed to Korean more than English. Any ideas? It's probably, my guess, is probably either the words light or more likely white, but maybe he is not able to make these kinds of, well, it's a bit harder to articulate the L or especially the W. It's a palatal glide, so maybe he can't articulate those yet at this stage very well. So it's probably white, and it's reduced and and he wants to make it. It ends with a T, but you know, he at this stage he's not doing consonant vowel consonant syllables yet. So he's going to break it, and he's going to kind of palatalize it, Korean style, with an E, just like, you know, Koreans say chi zi or jia zi, you know, or stop, adding that extra E, or judgy for judge. So he's adding an E. So it's kind of Koreanizing it. Can anyone explain number 5? I cannot. We have no idea where he got this word. I mean, it fits the CV structure, reduplication. So he was saying baka baka, and like, what do you want? He said baka baka. Like, we couldn't figure out what he meant until, well, one morning I was feeding him some cereal. So we didn't really give him like sugary kid cereals. I've been feeding him, introducing him to granola cereals, healthy adult cereals, and he likes that. So I'm feeding him some granola cereals, and he says, oh, baka baka. And I realized, oh, it's raisins. It's a word he made for raisins, and I have no idea. If any of you can explain to me how he got this, I would love to have a theory, a hypothesis. I don't know. He just made it up, I guess. Lexical development, so around half a year to 5 to 10 months. It seems that they can recognize adult words, and then toward 10 months, the meanings of those words. So they start to learn the meanings of words, even though they can't say the words. They show that they can recognize the words. And also, by the way, around 6 months, they start to show a psychological property called intersubjectivity, which is kind of interesting for conversation later on. So subjectivity is like, you know, focusing on the self. So before 6 months, they can maybe make direct eye contact with just a caregiver or maybe with an object. But around 6 months, they can kind of go back and forth and watch. If a caregiver is talking about like a toy, their eyes can go back and forth, and they know that the parent is talking about the toy. So it's called intersubjectivity. They're focusing on the speaker and an object, for example. And they're starting to also understand that in a primitive way, the person talking to them has their own mind and their own kind of inner thought life, that's a person too. They're starting to understand that. And that's important later for discourse and pragmatics. Anyway, around a year, I mean, these are just averages. There's a good deal of variation. But around a year or so, they start producing their first simple words like appa and amma. About 1.5 years, they've got about 50 words. And as soon as they get to the 50-word stage, they go through what's called a lexical spurt or vocabulary spurt, where they suddenly just start learning a lot of new words very quickly. Sometimes as much as seven words per day. Now, I didn't notice this as much with my son because he's exposed more to Korean. He's going to Korean first in the Arinijib, now Yuchiwon. So I didn't notice this as much, but I think my wife did. This lexical spurt, suddenly they just start learning a lot of new words very quickly. They start this massive vocabulary building program at around 1.5. And sometimes they engage in semantic overextension, like applying nana to yellow and epi to the color red and so on. And sometimes underextension, not realizing that, oh, that's a fish too, or that's a bird also. Syntax and morphology. Can you correct children's grammar, as I mentioned? Well, these cartoons, obviously the person who does this cartoon obviously has children, and one of them I think might be in the book. I draw the picture. Drew, huh? You drew the picture. I know that. I'm the one who drawed it. Okay. And here, I seen that kid on the playground. Oh, you saw that kid? Oh, you seen him too? You know, I've seen parents try to correct children like this, and it doesn't work. What's happening? Well, at 1.5 to 2 years, they're starting to combine words into simple two-word utterances, sort of like proto-sentences, kind of the beginnings of sentences. And they are often maybe simple noun-verb, noun-adjective patterns. Could be like agent, patient, doggy go, doggy bark, daddy hit toy or something, or topic comment, or a theme plus a verb or adjective like doggy cute. So stating a noun and then commenting on it, doggy cute, kitty mean, or something like that. Very few or no function words or inflectional morphemes, although they can understand them when grown-ups talk to them. And later on they start to produce a few gradually. They can understand those things though. And sometimes they depend on other cues for understanding. So it seems like they understand and they're just maybe making pragmatic guesses based on context. We talk about mean length of utterance, that is counting the number of morphemes in their utterances. So it's around 2 and then 3 morphemes per utterance. And then they start to show errors. So like I goed, I swimmed. So at first they are learning the irregular verbs or irregular forms and memorizing them individually and using them. But at a certain point it gets to be too much. You know, when you're going through this vocabulary spurt and there are too many verbs, it's far more efficient to apply rule, like for the past tense or the ing form. So they start to figure out the rules and they over-apply them. And this is evidence for some kind of universal grammar or innateness, that they are learning a rule, but they're over-applying it. And so like last summer, my son would say, oh, I catched it. Now I'm not going to correct him, I will just kind of rephrase it back to him. Oh, you caught it? And then he'll repeat, yeah, I caught it. But then a minute later, again, he'll say, I catched it. But they gradually correct themselves. So they are learning a rule, like the past tense rule, an abstract rule, and at first they are over-applying it, and then they figure out, oh, these are irregulars, these are different. So they learn to divide the irregulars from the regulars when it comes to grammar forms. Classic experiment, the WUG experiment by a psycholinguist named Gleason. So this is with like kids under 5. These experiments show that they understand the rules, you know, probably by age 5, I think. So she used kind of made up words and had the children complete sentences with these made up words where they had to attach like a morpheme, like the plural morpheme, which they pronounced correctly, because the plural morpheme s can be s or z or is, or the e past ed form. And these are just made up words. This is a wug. There are 2, and the child says wugs, and it says it with the voiced z. So the child knows the grammar and the pronunciation, the allophones here. And with he's spowing, yesterday he spowed, the child says. So they understand the grammar and even the allophones for certain morpheme variants, allomorphs. The famous WUG study. When it comes to adults, there's a famous study you'll hear about, Johnson and Newport, 1989. And this has to do with the critical period. So they looked at several dozen Korean and Chinese immigrants to the U.S. They came to the U.S. at different ages, what we call age of arrival. And as adults, they took a number of grammar tests and showed in a lot of different grammatical categories. Those who came here before puberty, or came to the U.S. before puberty, scored very well, almost native-like on various grammar tests. Those that came to the U.S. after puberty, like as teenagers or adults, they had much weaker scores, and a lot more variability or variation in their grammar scores on a number of different grammatical categories. And this is a classic study showing the critical period effect for adult learners. Those who first started learning English as teenagers or adults had a lot more difficulty. And a lot of other studies have replicated this for syntax, morphology, phonology. And these studies have looked at and shown that it's not due to just experience or amount of input or motivation or cultural identity factors. It's purely the age at which they started learning the language. A lot of other studies have backed that up. So the critical period effect is real. There's lots of evidence for it, lots of psycholinguistic and scientific evidence for it. Pragmatic competence. Here's a cartoon. How much you want to cut the grass? Not much. I mean, how much money? I mean, I don't want to cut it much. The father's asking the son to mow or cut the grass, American house. Quantifier scope. What does the quantifier much refer to? And actually, children don't have that much trouble with abstract problems like quantifier scope sometimes, but not as much. They do have some problems with pragmatic competence. If you've been around children, you know they have trouble with turn-taking, interrupting. So adult conversation with turn-taking, pronoun reference, they might just start using a pronoun he, and you don't know what they're referring to or whom they're referring to. Or kind of assume knowledge, what we call common ground, assume knowledge. They'll start talking about a friend, and my son might do this, for example, a lot of kids do this. They'll start talking about a friend as if I should know who this friend is at school. I don't know, you haven't told me about him before. And they'll just start talking about him like I should know. So sometimes they have trouble with making assumptions about what the other person knows in a conversation, common ground knowledge. Register and formality, particularly in a language like Korean where you have kind of formal verb forms, they have trouble with kind of social register and such that, social appropriateness of comments. And of course they have trouble understanding implicature, metaphor, idioms. But by the way, when it comes to like the specific types of implicature in inference, they do have trouble. But it seems like they've got the general cooperative principle though. There's a famous psychology study, I didn't put it in here, but it shows that you could ask a child a silly question, a young child a silly question, but if you say it with a straight face, and it's like a serious question, they'll assume it's a real question, and they'll try to cooperate with you, and they'll try to give an answer. So in this study, they would ask children silly questions and ask it very seriously, like, what do bricks eat? Or, which is angrier, yellow or purple? And you say it with a straight face, and they'll think it's a real question. They try to answer it. It's really cute. So they do kind of understand the general sort of cooperative principle and such, and they try to answer silly questions. The critical period for language, and some people call it a sensitive period because it is a gradual decline in phonology is affected very early on, and then later syntax and morphology. It does not affect vocabulary, so no problem learning vocabulary, pragmatic competence in a second language. That's not affected by the critical period affects grammar, phonology, morphology, syntax. Misconceptions. Can you learn language just from media, watching videos, TV, going to Hagwon classes? Do you think so? Not so much, because language is a social communication tool. Although the critical period theory itself doesn't address this, it does say that you have to have input, and you have to have meaningful input. And input is not meaningful if it's just from a TV, or it's just from boring Hagwon classes and textbooks. That alone is not enough. It needs to be meaningful social input, meaningful social communication from some people interacting with people. It has to be social. This is something you don't hear about in terms of the critical period. It has to be meaningful input and social input. So in a sense it is automatic, but it depends on the amount of input, the quality of input. So if a child is not exposed to much language, the child is not going to learn as well. If a child is exposed to a rich language environment, including, as we discussed last week, books, parents reading to kids, parents talking to children, spending time with children, then they are going to get better, richer input, and they're going to be better at the language. So they will all be fluent by age 10, but just some are going to have better verbal skills if they get richer input from their environments. So infant directed speech is probably useful, maybe not necessarily required, but it can be useful. Does it mean that you learning, say, English as a second language as older people, or another language, does it mean you can't become fluent? That's a misconception. Sure, you can become fluent. It's just different. We'll talk next time about this. The process of learning a second language when you're older, you can still become fluent if you want to, and if you're able and willing to get input and practice and motivation. It's possible. There will be noticeable differences. It is possible to achieve very good pronunciation, but a phonetician could probably analyze your speech and see that you learned it as a second language. But for practical purposes, for work or study, for social relationships, it shouldn't matter if you speak with an accent. So you can become fluent in a second language. It's just that the process, it's not impossible, it's just different. And we'll get into that next time. So the critical period is pretty much proven. In psychology and biology, it's pretty much uncontroversial. It's pretty much accepted. It doesn't necessarily prove universal grammar. It's probably good evidence, but until I think the theory is formulated more precisely, we don't know. It's going to be a topic of debate for some time. Bilingualism. It seems that children from an early age, when they're exposed to two languages, are able to differentiate the languages. Exactly how is unclear. They do mix words sometimes, and it doesn't mean that they're confused necessarily. Sometimes it's code switching. Sometimes they're compensating because they don't know the word in one language. So yesterday my son called me and he told me that he was sick. He went to the doctor, he had an earache, and he said, I had yol. And I said, oh, you have fever. They didn't know fever. So he said he mixed in Korean. It may cause apparent or minor delays in learning, but that's more so not because they're overburdened mentally, but because their input is divided. The amount of input is divided between two languages. They're getting, instead of 100% of one language, they're getting, part of the time they're getting input in one language and part of the time input in another language. So it may be more of a matter of input, amount of meaningful input. There's a lot of psychology research showing cognitive benefits, meta-linguistic awareness that this doesn't have to be called a table, that's an arbitrary sign. It can be called, teksang, it could be called mesa or tish or some other word. It's relative, it's arbitrary. And, or in the book, there's a quote, one kid says, oh, where did you learn English? And the kid says, what is English? Because, she's only known English. She hasn't known of other languages. She doesn't know what English is. They seem to have similar developmental trajectories in both languages, similar stages. And there's some question as to whether do they have two separate systems in their brains, one system for each language? There isn't much evidence for one unitary system. The evidence seems to point to either two separate systems or more likely two systems with some overlap. So like if a child is, like my son, Korean-English bilingual, obviously the grammars are very different. He has two grammars in his head for Korean and English. There's probably some overlap, like shared vocabulary, representations in his head for shared vocabulary, maybe a few grammar structures that are maybe similar, especially say an English-German bilingual would probably have more overlap in their syntactic representations in their brains for some of the syntax. But pretty much they have generally different grammars. Code mixing that's probably contextually conditioned, depending on context. And again, similar to, patterns of development in their both languages. There's nothing abnormal about bilingualism. That was my son. A more recent picture. He's like, no, he wants to do this when he takes pictures. It's a silly thing that Korean kids do, I guess. I don't know why. So these are common myths. It does not confuse children. It does not cognitively burden them or stress them. It is normal. At least half of kids in the world grow up in bilingual or multilingual environments, and they don't have problems with 2 or even 3 languages. Does not cause any significant delays in language development. Code switching, like I have y'all, it does not mean confusion. It's for various reasons. It does not mean delays or problems. There are valid reasons for doing code switching. And even children who have learning disabilities, cognitive impairments like autism, they can still be exposed to 2 languages. And this is the neat thing about the critical period. A child, even with autism or other cognitive impairments, can still learn 2 languages. I once knew a kid who had kind of a high-functioning Asperger's. He was a young adult. He was Korean American. His parents moved to New York when he was young, and some quack clinicians told his parents, "Oh, just teach him English. 2 languages will confuse him." And then they moved back to Korea, and he had a lot of trouble, fitting into Korean culture and learning Korean because of some really bad advice that some clinician gave his parents. That's bad advice. It's based on really old research that was poorly done, but the research shows that bilingualism is easy for all kinds of kids. It doesn't cause any problems. Good. I have a couple minutes. Do you have any questions? Talk to each other for a minute. Come up with a question. Because I've always wanted to do this. Like, give you time. Talk to each other. Come up with a question you want to ask me. I'll try my best to answer it. I'll try my best to hear you. You may have to shout your questions at me. But trilingualism? Yeah, so again, much of the research is on just bilingualism, so there's not much on trilingualism. Okay, so you had Urdu, Telugu, Tamil, Telugu, and English. Oh, you're from southern India. Okay. So trilingual, and of course you're not confused. Yeah, so I would imagine the same applies to trilingualism. Nobody has really done much research on this. Is there a limit? Can a child learn 4 languages without going crazy, or 5? We don't know, but that's a good question. We really don't know. You could do research on that someday. Do research on that, because that's something that needs to be studied. Is there an upper limit? What constitutes being fluent in a language? That is a good question. Different linguists, especially when it comes to L2 learning, that is learning a language when you're older, different linguists will have kind of different theoretical definitions or criteria for what constitutes bilingualism, what constitutes fluency. So that's a good question. They'll probably look at maybe advanced syntactic structures, maybe some of the more unusual syntactic structures that you learn maybe toward age 10 or you have to learn in school. Like maybe we'll look at certain kinds of unusual relative clauses in English we'll look at next time, maybe talk a bit about next time. They might look at your processing times through psycholinguistic experiments, how long it takes you to process sentences, including complex sentences, ambiguous sentences. They might look at do a fine-grained phonetic analysis of your speech in the L2 and see if there's any variation that would indicate things like that. So the different people have different criteria. That's probably something to look into. The different definitions constitutes L2 fluency. Good question. Another question. Okay, the influencing factors of multilinguals. Are you asking like what factors influence children's bilingual learning? Well, I think one factor is the amount and quality of input. So again, are they getting input from like people who are close to them? So the quality of input, also the amount of input. So like my son, obviously his Korean is better than his English. He goes to a Korean Yuchiwon. During the day he spends time with his mother. I am his main source of English input, as well as a few people on the weekend, and sometimes English videos. So the amount of input and who is it from, I think is going to be a factor. Other factors tend to be, especially as they get older, do they feel some kind of stigma attached to one particular language? Are they in an environment where maybe one of the languages is in the general culture maybe looked down upon or stigmatized, and that might affect their cultural identity later, especially as they become teenagers and their self-identity develops. They might react against that. So, and it's quite normal, for example, for Korean American, Chinese American kids in the US, they become teenagers, they really want to fit in, and so they'll kind of be less willing to speak in their home language, and they want to be American, because there's this cultural pressure to adapt and conform and such. So cultural pressures, cultural identity, especially later on. They can still understand Korean or Chinese or whatever, but they're less willing to speak it. And then we talked a bit before, I think, about your cultural identity. For like bilingual Koreans in the US, when they're speaking Korean, they feel Like they're more collectivistic. When they're speaking English, they feel more individualistic and assertive. That is interesting factor. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, I guess that's all the time for questions. And I hope I can, I'll do this when I can have question time. And also I haven't put this up on the website yet, but I'll put up a little Google form later, give you a chance to ask questions during the last week of classes. All right, good luck in your short paper. It's due in a couple of weeks. Enjoy your homework. See you later.